saying that debt sustainability concerns are looming large for these 5 states. In fact, the stress tests that have been done are also showing that 5 of the most indebted states in India could see further deterioration in fiscal conditions, with their debt to GSDP ratio remaining above 40% in 2027. So are these states mini Sri Lankas in the making is the question that we're asking. Let me take this across to our consulting editor. Mythili Bhusnurmath is joining us on this leg of the show. Mythili, great to have you. A very good evening. Now, as per the bulletin, I was talking about these stress tests that are showing that the fiscal conditions of the most indebted states in India may deteriorate even further, and those may require corrective measures. That's what the RBI is saying in that bulletin. I want to know from you how your reading is. How precarious is the situation if you were to read between the lines that the RBI is putting out?
Well, the situation of almost all of our states is not very great, and these particular 5 states that they have mentioned are 5 among 10 states that the RBI has listed where the fiscal condition is not very satisfactory. But ironically, just as RBI is pointing to these states, the IMF points to the government of India and says that our debt, national debt to GDP ratio, is also unsustainable. So this is a question of how does one look at it? Yes, the fiscal condition of the states is not good. The 5 most stressed states in terms of fiscal condition, particularly the debt to GDP ratio, GSDP ratio, that is a gross state domestic product ratio, is very high, much above what the desirable level should be. And the report lists out Bihar, Kerala, Punjab, Rajasthan and West Bengal as the 5 most stressed states. And it also points to the dangers of the path that the states are treading in terms of the falling share of the state's own revenue. Also, the increasing number of freebies that are being given by the states, and 2 particular states, Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh, which have gone back on the NPS, the new pension scheme, and have decided to go back to the old pension scheme, which is, defined benefit, which is one of the reasons why the center moved away from that and introduced the NPS, because it found that the pension burden was completely unsustainable. But on the contrary, we do find 2 states which have gone back to the old pension scheme. So it's a combination of things that the states are doing, the fact that their own revenue has been falling, the fact that they have been giving a lot of freebies, and the subsidy burden has been growing. When we talk about subsidies, there are 2 kinds of subsidies, merit and non-merit subsidies. Merit subsidies are those which in fact help the larger economy and perhaps one can live with them. But non-merit subsidies are the kind that states like Punjab are giving, free power, free electricity. These are completely non-merit subsidies and have deleterious effects in the long run. So certainly the position of the states is not satisfactory. They need to do much more, particularly to increase their own share in the total revenue. But the fact is that COVID has not helped any of the states. It has not helped the center either. So these are hard times we have to live through. But remember also in all this, the Constitution limits the borrowing power of the states. In fact, under Article 293(3) of the Constitution, no state government can borrow on its own without central permission, which is why we have seen in the past few months constant fracas between the center and state governments, with some state governments wanting to raise more money, borrow more, and the center laying more and more conditions and imposing restrictions on them. So I think this is part of fiscal federalism, but none of this takes away from the fact that yes, all of us, the center and the states, need to improve their tax to GDP ratio and bring down their debt ratio, debt to GSDP or debt to GDP ratio. This cuts across center, states, but in the case of these particular 5 states that the RBI bulletin has identified, the position is particularly adverse and needs to be speedily remedied.
But Mythili, you spoke about the Indian growth story as well. It's not just the problematic states that we are talking about with a growth rate of 8.7% in FY22. The bulletin also says that India's gross domestic product has surpassed its pre-pandemic level by 1.5%, and the recovery remains robust in FY23 so far. Does this match your reading of the economy as it stands now? Because the real question is, are we going to be, with these kind of outlooks, are we actually placed to avoid stagflation, a condition where demand remains stagnant but unemployment and prices continue to rise? Can we avoid that?
Well, it's going to be a little difficult because there are talks about large parts of the world, particularly the US, possibly heading into recession. India, I don't think we'll head into recession because clearly we are growing. Even if 8.7 comes on the back of a contraction of 6.6% in the previous fiscal, the fact is that we are nowhere near a recession. We are growing. We have lost 2 years, but now we've reached the pre-pandemic level. But if you look at inflation and you look at the combination of inflation and growth, what does stagflation mean? Stagflation just means high inflation and stagnant growth. And if you look at it from that perspective, there is a very clear possibility of India heading to stagflation because inflation has now reached a level where it's going to become an impediment to growth. And this 8.7% must be taken, as I said, with a pinch of salt. It comes on the back of a contraction in the previous fiscal. Going forward, growth is be nowhere near our potential. It will be perhaps stagnant. So to that extent, I think if you talk of stagflation as being a combination of stagnant growth and high inflation, we could very well be there before the end of the next fiscal.
Mythili, the problem of the big overdues of power distribution companies has also been spoken about in the bulletin, and it has been around. This problem has stood for a long time. Where growth concerns rise, crude oil prices go up, coal shortages become the order of the day. How much bigger do you reckon this problem is going to balloon into?
Well, this has been a big problem for India, not just now, but in the past many years. There have been successive attempts to clear up the mess in the power sector, have reforms in the discoms, but really hasn't got us very far, simply because in the democratic kind of setup, there's this enormous temptation on state governments to offer freebies. So every time you have elections coming around, you find incumbent governments and even other political parties offering free power, free electric, free water, loan waivers. So I think this is something that comes perhaps with democracy, and until electorates are sufficiently educated and understand that nothing comes for free. If today I'm getting free power today, that means possibly no power tomorrow. So I think this is going to be a tough lesson, and state governments must learn to become more responsible. But this cuts across all political parties. You've seen even the ruling BJP in many of the state elections offer farm loan waivers. Now the fact is, as I said, however cliche it may sound, there is no free lunch. So if you offer these kind of freebies, it is going to come back, the chickens are going to come back to roost. So I think this is something that democracies will have to learn, that populist measures cannot take you very far. They may be good in the short term, but long term, they're always a disaster. And that is a learning, I think, that must come across, and must come across to all political parties. Power sector reform, is loan waivers. These are classic examples of freebies. We are certainly a way to kind of, slippery slope leading you to further and further distress in the long term.
Distress, if we continue with freebies, and that's something that perhaps we've seen a lot in democracies across the world. How much pain this adds to our current environment, that is something that really is going to be in the spotlight for some time now. This really puts it in perspective. Mythili, thanks very much for joining us with that. Meanwhile,